I'm going to talk a little bit about wind impacts on tree growth and tree mechanics, and concentrate mainly on damage, because that's where I've been mainly working. If nothing else, when you go away from today, I want you to really understand that the mechanics, the mechanical properties of trees and the mechanical performance of the tree is just as important as the hydraulic functioning of the tree and the photosynthetic capacity of the tree. Trees respond all the time to mechanical forces on them. And if you don't understand that, if we don't incorporate that in our growth models, in our understanding, we will not understand how trees function. And it's extraordinary to me. I can still talk to tree physiologists who've been working in tree physiology for years, and they've never heard of thigmomorphogenesis and Frank Tulusky and Jaffe's work. And they don't understand that the trees are responding all the time to what's going on and what they have to put up with. Okay, so the outline of the presentation, just a little bit about wind as a damage agent to trees and forests, then a little bit on the effect of wind on tree growth, the acclimation of trees to the wind, how they adjust to the fact they're in this windy environment, then a little bit about trade-offs in tree functioning, then different factors that affect forest vulnerability to wind, forest and tree vulnerability to wind. Then I get into some risk management in forests, particularly on wind risk. I'm going to talk about wind risk model that I developed, and then how we're trying to model forest vulnerability at the regional and European scale. And such things are becoming possible now. And then a little bit about linked hazards in forests and potential impacts of climate change. And then I'll summarize. Okay, so a cartoon that a colleague of mine, Juan Suarez, drew based on Carl Nicholas's summary. In a plant, or a tree in this case, there are different functional requirements. Obviously, it's got to photosynthesize, it's got to make assimilates, it's got to be able to conduct water, it's got to be able to reproduce, or that it's going to die out, but it's also got to be able to stand up. There's no point trying to make assimilates if you can't keep your crown up in the light. And the plants and trees are having to trade off between those different functional requirements. And I think there's a huge challenge there for somebody that wants to get into that, how those trade-offs work, because I think that's a really interesting topic, and probably varies depending on where the tree is growing or the plant is growing. Okay, so wind damage to trees. Here's a picture from a colleague, John Moore in New Zealand. You're getting some wind damage in the radiata pine forest there. More damage in New Zealand. Here's a very nice picture John showed. I don't know if you can see it, but some trees are standing up. This is very rolling terrain, and others have been completely flattened. Oh, I should use this, shouldn't I, since you set it up for me. Okay, now wind damage can occur at all scales in a tree or a plant, from the leaf needle scale right up to community and regional scale. So if we look at damage at the leaf scale, you can get damage by abrasion of leaves, where the cuticle gets damaged and you get water loss. Another picture here, you can see these leaves are wilting. Or you can get damage to fruit. So here, avocado's been rubbing and has become damaged. So that's one scale. Then if you go up next scale, you can get leaf damage. You can get leaves blown off, or you can get whole branches blown off. This is somewhere in the tropics after a strong tropical storm. I think this was in the United States somewhere, and this tree's been stripped of most of its branches. And then at the sort of plant level, community level, this is just to show you it can happen in cereal crops as well. This is in urban environments. I think I think this might be Singapore, or a forest in Wales with the esteemed researcher investigating that problem. You can see here you've got some trees that have overturned and some that are broken. If you're a forester, this is preferable to this, because at least you'll recover all of the product there, but you're going to have a problem here. And then here, if anybody knows England, this is the Lake District. Here you've had the wind coming from the bottom right corner. Notice all the trees on this established edge have survived, but inside you've got damage. Also damage here where the wind looks like it's run down this forest road and hit the trees. And then at a larger scale, so the map here is southwest France, where I'm now living. You can get huge disturbance. So this is the Black Forest in 1999, storm Lothar, which caused a huge amount of damage in Europe. In 1 or 2 nights, as much timber as we harvest in the whole of Europe was blown down. This is where I live now. This is the flat Leyland forest massif south of Bordeaux. It's very flat. It's obviously been quite wet here. All this maritime pine is blown over. Probably the wind was coming from the top left here, and they clear felled all here, and then all the trees are blown down. Huge amount of damage in 99, and then 2009. 2009, about 44 million cubic meters of timber lost in one night. Price of timber went from 40 euros a cubic meter at the roadside to 1 overnight. Here's in tropics in the Caribbean, serious damage, and of course it can have another. This is one of the Pacific Islands, coconut plantation damaged, and here a banana crop completely destroyed. When a colleague, Jan Schellhaus, he did a study of causes of damage to European forests, and he went back in the literature and he's looked at the levels of damage that have been suffered by European forests. And what you'll see is that it's slowly increasing. And there's some peak years. 1990 was bad, 1999 was bad, 2005, 2007. But what's interesting is that most of the damage is from wind. So the purple at the bottom is wind. More than 50% of all damage by volume in Europe is from the wind. And yet, how many wind experts are there in Europe? How many wind experts are there in the world? How many insect people are there? And we get very frightened by pathogens and insects, and I understand why, but the big problem in Europe is wind. I think there's a perception you can't do anything about it. Might be one of the reasons. And for some countries in some years, that can be a considerable. Denmark, if a storm goes past Denmark, it takes out a lot of the country's timber. So Denmark can suffer, 7% of the growing stock can be taken out by a single storm. That's a big impact for a country. So here in the late 60s, in 1982, and they just keep getting hit in Denmark. Maybe, and they've tried various things. They've tried things like planting silver fir around the Norway spruce as a wind barrier. In other countries like France, it's at a lower level, but in some years it can be very bad. So this is 2009, and that's the reason why I'm working in France now. Sorry, the next one. Some of the slides seem to take longer to load up. So there's been a lot of interest in Europe because of the wind damage, but actually, it can be a real problem here in the United States with hurricane damage up the east coast of the United States. Let me see if I can. In Japan, it's a big problem. New Zealand. Okay, so that's just a map showing by annual wind damage levels per percentage of growing stock. And most of the damage in terms of percentage of growing stock is in Central Europe. So countries like Germany and Czech Republic and Slovakia really suffered quite badly. So this is in the 2009 storm, just to show you tree movement in that storm, blowing around. And this is what trees have to put up with. I think the real miracle is that they stand up at all. I mean, if you think how tall they are and the big sail area they've got, and when you look at their roots, they're not so substantial, and yet the trees stand up. So what I'm trying to do in this talk is to get you to understand how do trees do that, and how does it affect the way they grow. Oh yeah, we get some nice music now. But this one's really incredible. Just keep an eye on these trees here. Wow. Bang. And you see there's a lot of rain there as well, which probably is adding to the load on the trees. And then this rather sad, this is a big araucaria. This is in New Zealand, in the middle of a town. So any of you are interested in urban forestry, I hope there wasn't a house underneath that guy. It's embarrassing to be standing here talking about plant response to touch and wind when Frank's in the audience, but we've known about that for a long time, but not everybody realizes it. So here's Arabidopsis that hasn't been touched, and here's Arabidopsis that has been touched. And the same is true of trees. So these are some seedlings in a wind tunnel experiment we did in Scotland, and this one has had no wind on it, and this one's had the wind blowing on it. So there's a significant impact in the way that plants respond. And the trees are trying to, all the time, in the genetic material is a way to counteract the wind loading and the forces that are either trying to break them or uproot them. So one nice example is buttressing in shallow tropical soils, where you get this beautiful buttressing that attempts to minimize the stresses that you get on the tree. So you don't have sudden changes in angle, which can be a stress concentration, but you get nice smooth transitions, and you get this buttressing to help support the tree. If any of you have been to Europe and been to see some of the beautiful cathedrals in Europe with the flying buttresses, similar sort of idea. Some of the work on tree response to wind goes back to end of the 18th century. But this gentleman, Max Jacobs, did some experiments on what happened if you restricted tree movement. And what he found is that he looked at trees that were guide and trees that were free to sway. And what you see is that here's age, and here's the diameter at 1.3 meters. So the trees that were free to sway, their diameter was larger than the ones that were guide. So the trees that were guide didn't grow as much in diameter as the ones that were guide. And if you look at the stem shape, so here's in 1938. This is a long time ago. And then 10 years later, so here's the stem shape. So this is height on the stem and diameter. And as in the following 10 years, you can see the guide tree all the way down is smaller than the tree that's free to sway. If you want to know how that happens, talk to Frank afterwards. We did some experiments in the UK. We did a thinning experiment, and then we guide some of the thin trees. So you can see here we had a set of guys on it, and we looked not just at the stem, but we looked at the roots. It's a little bit difficult to see, but what happened is that the thin trees, they're going to respond. They've got more light, but they've also got more wind. And you can see, particularly in the roots, the thin trees had grown a lot more than the control. So here's the control on the bottom, and then these are the roots at 1/2 meter away from the stump, and at 0.25 meters. But the interesting thing is that the trees that are thinned but guide don't respond as much. So these guys are responding because there's increased wind loading, but these guys don't have to respond as much. And you see similar things in the stem. But what I think was particularly interesting is that here's the control trees, and here's the thin trees. Well, they've got bigger crowns. So this is crown branch mass. They've got bigger crowns. They've got more space now, more light availability. They start filling that space. But the ones that were thinned and guide, they have a bigger crown. So they're saying, I don't need it in the roots. I don't need it in the stem. I'm going to put it in the crown. And I'm going to get ahead of the guy next to me. Okay. There's been some more experiments more recently, both in Nancy, in Beach. Vivian Bonser has written some papers on this. This was his PhD. So what they did was they did an experiment, similar guying type experiments, but they also did a really nice experiment where 3 times a week they went along, and for 20 seconds they pulled selected trees with different forces. And what they did was they tried to simulate the force on the tree that you would get on average once a week, the maximum force. The maximum force you would get once a month. And then the force that you would get on average, the maximum force you get once a year. And what they saw happen is that the growth, so this is the growth with time through the year, that there seemed to be a threshold level, and if the trees were not really responding to those tugs. I mean, we're talking 3 sets of 20-second pulls each week for a few weeks. But once you pulled them hard enough, they jumped up and they started to grow faster. We've just now repeated that experiment with maritime pine, and we don't see this threshold. We see, for any amount of additional pulling, we see a growth response instantaneously. You have microdendrometers on it, you can just see the trees responding. It's truly incredible when you see it. So the more you pull the trees, and we're talking 20 seconds, 3 times a week, the trees start to grow. So they're really very sensitive to any change in on the forces that they're experiencing. Okay, this is an experiment we did a few years ago. Franca Bruchert did this with me when she was doing a postdoc in Scotland. We had a forest over here, which was a nice edge, and we know the wind loading changes as you go back from the edge. So we looked at trees just in from the edge. I think it was 1 tree height back, 2 tree heights back, and 9 tree heights back. And what we did was we looked at things like stem taper and crown properties, and stem eccentricity, and then we cut lumber from the trees and we looked at the properties of the lumber. This was published in American Journal of Botany. Well, things like tree height increases as you go back in the stand. So if you're on the edge where it's more windy and you're putting on more diameter growth, you can't have as much height growth. But when you get into the stand and it's more sheltered, you can get more height growth. So that's one of the things you see. This is eccentricity of, I should have one of Frank's discs now to show. So this is ring age, so here 5 years going through to 25 years. The blue are the trees right at the back, and this is a measure of eccentricity of the stem. So how non-circular it is. And at 90 meters back from the edge, it doesn't change very much as the tree grows. But here at the edge, the eccentricity becomes enormous. We also saw some differences in wood properties. It tended to be that the wood in the trees at the edge was less stiff. It was more flexible. It's another acclimation adjustment to the wind loading. Trees are more, the wood's more flexible. And you get some changes in wood properties. So rather extraordinary disc there with, I think the tree couldn't decide what it was doing. It's just put compression wood all over the place. And here's a nice electron microscope picture of some compression wood cells. You can see they're circular and they got cracks in the, they got checking in the S2 layer. I don't know. It does, doesn't it?
There was a knot above or below that might fall through the mechanical loading and that flexing.
It could be.
That's cool.
Just like it. And you can get compression creases in your lumber. So here's some compression creases. So on the siding compression, the wood has been damaged. So even in trees in lumber that may not on the surface look affected, you can get compression creases in the, so there's obviously a weakness. There's an effect on the wood properties. Okay, and Lorna Green wrote a very nice paper about how plants adapt at different scales, and acclimation to the wind's happening at every scale in the tree. So at the cell scale, the more wind, there's a reduction in the length and the diameter of vessels. You get a reduced length of wood fibers. You tend to get an increase in wood density. Again, the world expert on flexure wood, you get a type of wood called flexure wood, which has different properties to normal wood. That is a direct response to the movement of the tree. And you get reaction wood. Reaction wood is different from flexure wood. Flexure wood is really to deal with the flexing of the tree, whereas reaction wood is trying to get the tree back to point up towards the light. So reaction wood is like the muscles, if you like, of the tree, to get it back pointing the way it wants, where flexure wood is a response to make the wood more resilient to the flexing. So we've already seen a compression wood cell, so this is a classic drawing by Joser and Middleton, showing the differences between normal cells, which are more square, and the highly lignified circular cells in compression wood. And then you have acclimation in the leaves, needles, and flowers and fruit. Tend to have smaller leaves in trees that are more exposed to the wind, shorter needles, thicker cuticles to protect the leaves. Tend to get a little bit of decrease in seed production. And this is a rather dramatic example of what happens. This is a flagging, and Frank has written a nice paper in Plant Science on that, a review paper. When did that come out, Frank? 2012. Okay. This is in New Zealand. You can see it's a little windy. And in the branches, stem, and roots, you tend to get larger branch diameter in trees more exposed to the wind. They're more flexible material, so they can bend more, but they got denser wood at the outside, so they're actually stronger. So there's all these changes taking place, all designed to stop the tree being damaged. You often get eccentric growth. I'm going to show you an example of that in a little bit. Changed shape of the branches and stems and roots. Shorter stems. You get an increased grain angle. So the grain angle, the larger the grain angle, the more flexible the whole stem of the tree is. Change in allocation, so you start putting more into roots and less into the above ground stuff. So you've got to be really careful when you're doing biomass assessments. If you're in a windy location, there's a lot more down below. And we found that very clear in Britain. We got big variation in wind exposure. And Trees up in the northwest of Scotland are putting a lot more. The root-shoot ratio is quite different. And the other thing is it's harder to pull over the same size tree in the north of Scotland than it is in the south of England. So we call them soft southern sissies, you know. So it's a British joke. It probably doesn't play too well. Yeah, increased root-shoot ratio, an increase in the coarse to fine root ratio, an increase in secondary growth. So here's a nice picture that my colleague Bruce Nichol took. These are roots of Sitka spruce. So here you can see this is the biological center. Look at how eccentric the growth is there. Here's the biological center. This is a root that's on the side that's being flexed like that. It's, if any of you are engineers, this is as close to an I-beam as a plant can make it. So particularly in the roots, you get very big changes in the root shape, designed to get the maximum strength where you need it with the minimum material. There's no point putting material here because you don't need it. You need it up here and here to stop the root flexing. Another picture, quite eccentric tree growth and a huge amount of compression wood on the bottom right. And here's some work that Frank and I did years ago, and here on campus. And Frank was interested in some honey locusts that were growing around the library building. And so I did the wind simulation, and Frank did the measurements. And what we found is that the trees are eccentric in growth, and the eccentricity of growth really followed the flow pattern. So the direction of the flow around the library indicated the direction of eccentricity. And also the diameter was very strongly correlated. Was it the diameter or height? It was the height of the trees was very strongly.
I think it was the taper.
Taper.
I think we did height to diameter.
So the stronger the wind, the more tapered the trees were. That was a nice little experiment. We presented at a conference. We never wrote it up.
That was published in the proceedings.
Yeah. Okay, and at the whole tree level, you get leaf needle shedding. Better to lose your leaves rather than the whole tree. You can even shred branches. Loblolly pines particularly good at doing that. Get rid of the branches, reduce the drag rather than lose the whole tree. You can reconfigure. I'll show a picture of that in a second. So you reduce your drag. There's damping as well. I'll show you something on that in a second. Streamlining, increase in porosity in some species where they allow more wind through their crown. So here's streamlining. And Mark's done much better stuff than this. There's a couple of classic papers that came out of that group. Mark did one with conifers, and Volsinger did a few, 5 species of broadleaves. They're the kind of the best work on drag in different species. You see, this is a Scots pine in a wind tunnel in Farnborough, the aircraft research facility in the UK. And you can see the trees really streamlining. It's reducing the area that's exposed to the wind. And this is some nice work that my colleague John Moore, who's in New Zealand, did. This was his PhD when he was in Oregon. So he built a finite element model of a tree and looked at how it responded to the wind. And I really like this video. Hopefully it'll play. So the wind's going to come along, and what I want you to do is see the oscillation of the tree and then how the energy in the tree gets transferred into the branches. So, okay, there it goes. And then you can see all the branches start moving, and they start absorbing the energy in the tree, and the tree then, it gets very, very rapidly damped. So the wind motion actually gets transferred from the whole tree into the branches and then out to the sub-branches and so on. So it's a structural damping. It's incredibly efficient. they're tuned, the branches and the whole stem are tuned to actually maximize that damping effect. There's another review paper, I think again in Plant Science by Christoph Spatz, that is worth reading if you're interested in that issue. Okay, so how do trees control wind damage? They increase protective coating, they decrease the sail area, they increase the elasticity of the material so it can withstand greater distortion before damage. They increase the strength of outer material in branches and stems. They increase diameter where it's needed to give more resistant components. They add fuses, so they make the branches weaker than the stem to reduce the wind loading, preserve the plant. They have efficient damping systems to stop destructive swaying. They modify the allocation of assimilates. And they can regenerate either from damaged plant, from a damaged tree, or from seedlings. So here's an example of what happens in the dry forests in Puerto Rico. So they get a lot of hurricane damage. And if the tree gets damaged, this was to simulate damage. They bent it over. It just sprouts like a lot of the species that sprout from the base. So okay, we're adjusted to living in this windy environment. If a storm comes along and all the canopy's taken away, we'll just regenerate. So that's a mechanism of survival, even though a lot of damage has taken place. But there can be some trade-offs, and there's a number of papers on these. So Barbara Lackenbrook published a paper recently in New Phytologist showing that there can be a trade-off between hydraulic requirements and wind damage risk. So if you reduce the risk of wind damage by modification to the wood structure, there can be some hydraulic costs to that. Okay, so that's this trade-off in between these two functional requirements, if you remember our cartoon. There seem to be some trade-offs between reproduction and wind damage risk. But this is not well documented, and this paper, in fact, wasn't even in trees. This was, I think, in beans. But that's a trade-off between reproduction and mechanics. So if you want to be able to stand up to the wind more, there could be some trade-offs in reproduction, and nobody's looked at that in trees as far as I know. And trade-offs between light interception and wind damage risk. There's also been some work on that, but again, not very much. So that's trade-off on the right. Okay, so we're now, how are we doing? Talk a little bit more about the sort of stuff I've been doing, which is wind damage risk modeling. And one of the things a lot of forest managers don't do is do risk management in their forests. And the classic risk management cycle is a response to an event, in this case a storm, recovery of the forest, and then prepare for the next storm. And part of this system, you actually have to look at risk mitigation, how you mitigate against the risk of damage. And the risk mitigation cycle is as follows. You have to collect data, identify your hazard, calculate the risk, and that's where this wind risk model comes in. I'll explain that in a second. Then you have to assess alternatives. And they basically they come down to three. You can reduce the risk in some way. How do you reduce the risk? There's different ways of doing it, the way you manage the forest, or you have less value at stake. So you maybe change the mix of species you have. You can spread the risk. That might be buying insurance. So you don't, if it all gets damaged, you don't take all the risk. Or you can just say, actually, I can accept this level of risk. But if you don't do that, you're really kind of working in the dark as to how at risk your forest is. And it's not just for wind, this is for any hazard. And then you have to implement a plan. So what are the things that affect wind risk of trees? And this is a kind of schematic, shows the kind of things you have to take into account: the species, tree height, size of the stem, how knotty the wood is. Of course, if you're talking about overturning, you have to think about the soil and where the water table is. So for example, here's that picture again. Forest edges are a factor in wind risk. Now, what happened here was there was a forest edge here, but it wasn't an established edge. It was just an edge because there was a road going through there. And they clear felled here. And when the wind came along, bang, all that's gone. It just was not conditioned to the wind. So it's one of the main problems is if you're not careful about the way you harvest your stands, you can cause a lot of damage. And this is a big problem where I live in France, because there's lots and lots, thousands of owners, each with 10 hectares. And if this guy upwind of you clears his nice big maritime pine, then your forest is more at risk. Your thinnings can be a big problem. Here's line thinning in spruce in southwest Scotland. Line thinning is immediately after a thinning, the trees are more vulnerable to the wind. And just the way things are in life, thinning often gets delayed. You know, oh, it's meant to be done this year, and in fact, you're 5 years late thinning, and that's probably the worst thing you can do. It's usually best to get in early and to thin and get the trees conditioned to the wind. Gaps, any kind of gap you create in the forest can cause a problem. So here's how the wind loading, this is the extreme wind loading, changes with the size of any clearing. So this is in tree heights. So you create a clearing 2 tree heights in width, maybe because you're doing some harvesting and you make an area where you're going to collect the wood. You almost treble the wind loading on the trees just by creating a 2 tree height gap. Streamlining, how the trees streamline, that kind of data that Mark and colleagues collected is really important to know how well the trees streamline in the wind. Terrain is important. That's that picture I showed you from John Moore earlier. And what we did was we put together a model which is called Forest Gales. And there's 2 components to the model. One is here calculating the critical wind speed. That's the wind speed at which the stand will be damaged. And then you need some wind climate information. So once you know the wind speed, you need to know how likely that wind speed is at that location. So the same forest at the bottom of the hill and the top of the hill will have a different probability of damage, even though their critical wind speed might be the same. And you need growth and yield models to drive the model, and you need parameters to parameterize it. I'll show you how we get some of those in a minute. So the wind climate data first. Being British, we're very poor, so we couldn't afford to put anemometers all over the country. And colleagues of mine were in Orkney. If anybody knows, Orkney's on the top of Scotland, and it's very windy. There are almost no trees. And they were thinking, they were wanting to plant trees, and they discovered a sea captain had come back from sea to Orkney as retiring. He wanted to build himself a house. And he had put flags like this all over his property. And his logic was where the flags tore the least, because he'd been on a sailing ship, he'd seen flags tearing, was going to be where he'd build his house. So we did the same thing. We put little flags like this. They're made out of untreated cotton, and they tear linearly. It's linearly correlated with mean wind speed. A very quick, cheap way to get a wind climate data. But there's more modern methods now, so This is in the Basque Country of Spain, where they have lots and lots of anemometers all over the region. And you can then create yourself a wind climate data. But you need that so you can get the probabilities of damage. You need stuff about wood strength. You have this magnificent wood handbook here in the United States from your colleagues up in the Forest Products Laboratory in Madison. Fantastic. If you haven't got one, get yourself one. Or you can go in the lab. It's much more fun and break some timber. And then, so the wood strength stuff helps to tell you how likely breakage is of the stem, but how likely uprooting is. You get yourself a D4 caterpillar and pull over the trees. Or you can do it with a chainsaw winch. And these are some eucalyptus in Asturias in northern Spain that we pulled over. So I'll give you the little video here. So that was my colleague Didier, who's the tree pulling expert. Can you actually see the? It's about here.
You can see it bending.
It's starting to bend. It takes a little bit of time, but it's worth. So you have to go and get this kind of data. We pull over a variety of trees of different sizes on different soils to get. This is the part of the model. Most of the model is mechanistic, but this part is totally empirical because roots are complicated, and trying to model the mechanics of root systems is very, very hard. Is there any sound coming? What is amazing is just it is quite hard to pull these guys over. Sure. I'll just leave it running. It's kind of beautiful in there. Well, I find it beautiful. So I don't know how many would do of these a day, maybe 4 a day, because then we go and measure all the properties of the trees. Now it's going under its own weight. Crazy French technicians getting excited. This is the stand. It's about 25, 30 meter tall eucalyptus, which we're pulling over. We put tilt meters on them, so we could work out the angle. And in this line here, we had a load cell, so we could measure the force on the.
Is that a standard height that you always attach, or how do you account for that?
In this ones, we had to adjust it. They were so well rooted that if we pulled it at the standard height, which is recommended, they always broke. So we had to actually pull them from quite low to stop them breaking and to get them to uproot. So in this case, we had to modify normally it's half height that we try and pull at. This is really a crude experiment for a dynamic process. You know, when the wind is blowing the trees around, this is not, it's nothing like this, but it's the best we have at the moment. Somebody can prove me wrong, and then all my life's work's down the tube. But so most of the time they uprooted this. You can see there's a really quite big taproot in this eucalyptus. Sometimes they broke. That was the problem. That's why we had to drop the height. Here's how this is in a beech forest in northeastern France. This is just a 4x4 winch, electric winch that goes on the front of your 4x4, and it just has a little remote controller so you can pull it in. So you have to be careful sometimes. When doing pulleys and things around trees, we had to do that. One time we made a mistake of forgetting that you're doubling the load when you go around a pulley. And we heard this cracking sound. What is that? What is that? Is that the bark breaking or something? And then this one of these strops just flew apart, and that was quite spectacular. This is the beech, same sort of idea. most of the time uprooting, but quite often breaking at the stem. Yeah, biological systems are never straightforward, are they? No, and this is the model that we build. So here you put in information about the site, the type of cultivation and soil. Here you put in some stuff about the tree, the species. Here's just the growth model we're using. Here's information about the wind climate based on where you are in, this is for the UK. And it gives you critical wind speeds at which overturning and breakage will happen. So because the critical wind speed's lower for overturning in this case, the tree was more likely to overturn. And if you want the model, you can have it. But this version is a standalone that you put on a Windows PC, but we have a version in R that we're going to make into a library so that it can be available to anybody using R. Okay, so how do you drive a model like this, and how do you start modeling at large scale? Well, one of the big revolutions in forest science recently has been lidar, airborne lidar. And these are quite old images. This is a colleague of mine, Juan Suarez, that does a lot of work on that. I mean, it's just magnificent, isn't it? You can even see trees that are blown down underneath the main canopy. So we can now get information on every tree in the forest if you scan at a high enough resolution. So here's Aberfoyle. It's a forest north of Glasgow. And here, based on the lidar, is the volume across the forest. And then Juan's used derived parameters from the lidar to drive the forest scales model to predict the critical wind speed. So you begin to see patterns of critical wind speed in the landscape. So you start to be able to manage in a quite different way. The main problem is probably that we don't have soil at this kind of resolution. That's much more difficult. But you can even use satellite lidar. So this is the ISAT lidar, which was really developed to measure elevation of ice sheets, but has been used by colleagues at Swansea University to get the heights of trees across Europe up to 60. I don't know why they abandoned the north of Sweden. We've also used forest inventory data from across Europe. So this is European Forest Institute, who I work for now. They compiled this map of forests in Europe, and we have data on, interpolated data on the species, the basal area, the height, and the spacing of trees across Europe. It's a bit dodgy. It's as good as we can get, but you can then use it to calculate a vulnerability map of the whole of Europe. Now, you'll immediately see there's a problem. Although many things in Europe are standardized and are regulated by the European Commission, forests are not. So every country has its own forest policy. And national inventories are all different in every country. So I don't know what's going on in the Netherlands, but all their trees should have blown over. And similarly here in Finland. So there's some differences in the data we're getting from the forest inventories that mean that there are some discrepancies that we need to work on and try and work out how to improve this. But now, because we've done tree pulling on some broadleaves like beech, we're able to do a better job than we were before when we only had conifers. So as we add more species to the tree pulling data we have, I think we can continue to do a better job of this.
Your earlier data set where you showed vulnerability and actual windstorm damage, Denmark, I would think, should have been numbers.
Yeah.
Highly vulnerable, Nick, you've got it up in the 60-50.
There's a lot of beech in Denmark. Does this include the beech?
Yeah, it does include beech, yeah.
Resistance.
Could be. And the problem is that the data people are very, they're very guarded about their data. So we're not, it's hard to actually dig into the data and find out more. It's one of the weaknesses that we don't have good forest inventory data. But anyway, hopefully that will improve. Okay, just sort of finishing up now is, one thing to remember is that it's always a mistake to only think of one hazard in a forest. If you're a forest manager or you're trying to plan a silvicultural system, there are always different risks, different hazards affecting the forest, and quite a lot of these are coupled. So bark beetles, Ips, comes in straight after a windstorm. So this is a bark beetle attack. It's very nice work showing where the damage was. This is Lake Geneva here. So this is in Switzerland, and then where the wind damage was. So you can see there's a very nice correlation between where the bark beetle damage was worst and where the wind damage was worse. So once you get wind damage in a stand, then you've got damaged trees, broken stems, and the beetles will come in. And you get maybe 10, well, if you do something about it and you clear out all the broken stems and clear the broken trees out, then maybe you can control the damage. But there was a particular problem in the Tatra Mountains. There's an area there which was a national reserve, was not a designated area, not allowed to touch. They got a big downslope windstorm. They didn't clear it, and the bark beetles started to go crazy, and they started then moving into the undamaged stands next door, and they had to go to the European Commission and ask for a special release to do sanitary felling before the thing got out of control. It was, yeah, in northern Slovakia. Yeah, it's really odd. It just came pouring down it was in northern Slovakia. So, you know, there's a lot of links between hazards and damage. So if you get drought, you increase the fire risk, you increase the bark beetle. If you get wind throw, then you've got a lot of material on the ground, your fuel loading's higher, you get more risk of fire and more risk of bark beetles. I think this is the big challenge for people interested in forest risk is how to deal with all these different hazards. And climate change, well, we're not sure about wind at the moment, and you get these kind of predictions showing this is the wind speed change in the future, and showing that I live somewhere here, and there's in the Bay of Biscay there's predictions of an increase in the wind in that region, which could be very bad news for our forests. But it's not clear at the moment. I think overall people would say we're going to get less storms in Europe, but they're going to be more intense. That's the kind of consensus at the moment.
Looks like Denmark isn't faring very well either.
No, Denmark's written off. They might as well go back to making Lego, I think. Okay, so in summary, all trees respond to the mechanical demands of the self-weight and the wind. They acclimate to their local wind climate, and this affects their growth, how they allocate, assimilates, and the properties of the wood. And that response occurs at all scales, from the cell wall to the whole tree. But the response may involve trade-offs with other functional requirements. When wind loading becomes too high, trees can fail in the branch, stem, or roots. And wind damage can occur in all scales, from leaf, needles to whole ecosystems. It's quite sobering to realize that the whole of the taiga forest in Russia has had wind blow in it. So that's their regeneration system. You get wind blow, and then you get seedlings coming up in the freshly exposed soil. And a wind is a major disturbance in many forests and forest ecosystems. And wind damage is often associated with other disturbances, for example, fire and beetle attack. And wind damage can have serious economic, environmental, and social impacts. I remember we had a conference in Brussels, and it was after a project, and we got people together, and we got a Swedish forest owner to come and talk to us, and he had lost a whole bunch of his forest in 2005. And you know, this is a big, tough Swedish forester, and he just starts crying as he's telling you about his forest gone, because he's lived with it his whole life. And the social impact on particularly communities which are very culturally attached to their forests can be enormous. A lot of suicides after the windstorm in Sweden. You know, people, that was their savings. That was how they had invested for the future, for their retirement, for their daughter's wedding or whatever. So let's go to Australia now. So we saw some tree pulling earlier, and this is a video from Australia. Better music this time. Oh, sorry. Let's see if we can get this to play. Yeah, this is it. This is near Melbourne. See, it's a bit windy. Stuff's falling on the road. Ooh. What amazes me is, this is an Australian and pickup truck, and there's no swearing. I think I think it's just so shocked. I'm still alive. Okay, so we made a publication a couple of years ago on living with storm damage to forests. You can download it from the EFI site. It's a kind of, it's scientific, but it's really designed for practitioners. So it kind of synthesizes all our knowledge on wind damage to forests. So you can download that for free. And you can also, this is a review article I did with Pete Berry and Bruno Mulia on wind impact on exactly what we're talking about. But it was a bit wider. It talked about plants as a whole. Okay. And I think, and finally, conference in July in Boulder. It's the 8th International Conference on Wind and Trees. Some people here will be there. Thank you very much for your time.